Okay, well, we're up to 50 people, so that seems like a propitious moment to start. So welcome everyone. I'm Cole Harrison, Executive Director of Mass Peace Action. I want to welcome you to our webinar on militarization of the police and the 1033 program. The webinar is sponsored by Mass Peace Action's working group on racial justice and decolonization. As you know, the police have become increasingly militarized in the United States over the past decades. We have armored personnel carriers, we have MRAPs, which are sort of these armored vehicles. We have assault rifles, submarine guns, flashbang grenades, grenade launchers, sniper rifles, SWAT teams, and intelligence strategies that have been adopted by the police in recent years. And so we're going to take a look at this. One of the key programs that enables that militarization is the US government's 1033 program, but it's not the only. And we're going to take a look at the background of the issue, the politics of it, and how it fits into the overall crisis of policing and racial justice, and what can be done about it. Let's see. We're joined by three speakers tonight. William Hartung is Director of the Arms and Security Program at the Center for International Policy, and he's the author of Profits of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. And we've had the pleasure of sponsoring Bill Hartung for several previous talks on a variety of subjects connected to the militarism and the military budget. Dan McFadden is a staff attorney with the ACLU of Massachusetts, and he works on civil rights and civil liberties issues, as well as immigrants' rights and criminal justice reform. And Yasmine Taeb is Senior Policy Counsel for Demand Progress, an experienced human rights lobbyist. And she recently formed a strategy coalition on the 1033 program for advocacy groups to try to impact the debate in Washington, which is when I learned about her work. So without further ado, we're going to get started. I've asked each panelist to speak for 10 or 15 minutes, and afterwards we'll take questions. You can go ahead and start putting your questions in the chat if you already have a question, or if one comes to your mind as we talk, and we'll take as many questions and discussion as we can. So over to you, Bill.
Yes, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to Massachusetts Peace Action for organizing this. And I'm honored to be on this panel. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues, and I'll just kick it off with a few thoughts. So the 1033 program is just part of the larger problem of police militarization, but I'll start there, and I'm sure we'll branch out into the other aspects of the problem. The program has been around for a couple decades, and so far that we know of, $7.4 billion in equipment has been transferred under the program to 8,000 different state and local police agencies. So it's a pretty significant and steady flow. And as Cole suggested, it's all manner of military-grade equipment, armored vehicles, including mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, MRAPs, which were developed for the Iraq War and Afghan War, tens of thousands of assault and sniper rifles, grenade launchers, bayonets, battering rams, helicopters, night vision devices, military helmets, body armor, camouflage. So not only is it a huge flow, but many of these things are things that police departments couldn't possibly acquire on their own. An MRAP costs on the order of $750,000, $500,000 to $750,000 per item. So these clearly would not be on our streets if it wasn't for this program. And as I suggested, there's sort of a direct link from the battlefield to the home front, because in the case of the MRAPs, when they found that the existing armored vehicles could not protect against improvised explosive devices, in Iraq and Afghanistan. They built these bulked up vehicles with more resistant floors and so forth, the MRAP. But they went to town on it. They built 27,000 of these things for $45 billion. So as the wars reduced in the numbers of troops, of course, they're not over yet, but as they reduced the troops, they had huge surpluses. They've got probably 10,000 or more that they're trying to get rid of. So over 1,000 of those have gone to local state police forces. They're getting rid of some to the United Arab Emirates, which could well up being used in the war in Yemen. So that they're looking to move these things. They don't want to spend the money it costs to destroy them. So they're just proliferating them at home and abroad. I wanted to quote from a New York Times Magazine article that underscores this. C.J. Chivers is an ex-Marine, award-winning journalist who covers arms trade and military issues. And as a younger person, he was deployed as a military person to Los Angeles at the time of the Rodney King beatings. And his piece was about his concerns about it at the time and his concerns about it now, the militarization of the police and the recruitment of actual military personnel to engage in what should be policing activities. So he says, within a few years of these vehicles becoming ground force mainstays for American troops fighting the Islamic State in Iraq and the Taliban in Afghanistan, tactical military vehicles were on offer for civilian police agencies, at times with Department of Defense assistance or encouragement. So was other equipment developed for combat forces: sniper rifles, holographic sights, bomb disabling robots, night vision devices, upgraded ballistic helmets, body armor, and more. So part of what's important in what he's saying is that some of this was coming at the same time it was going to the battlefield, it was going to our police. So it wasn't even sort of sequential. It wasn't like, all right, they've used this stuff up and now they're going to hand it over. There was stuff, basically fresh equipment that was being sent directly to the police, never made it to the battlefields. And so there's how this equipment can be used, of course, but there's also the impact on the attitudes of police forces. And basically, it's been found that it encourages them to view themselves as an occupying force, not a force for public safety. And there's been studies to show that when police receive this military equipment, they're more likely to use force and they resort to force more quickly. So there's certainly other elements driving police violence, but this exacerbates the problem. In the recent uprisings since the murder of George Floyd, NBC News found examples of 29 armored vehicles being used to put down local demonstrations. And they were in places, large cities like Philadelphia, but also smaller places all over the country. And they're not just used at demonstrations. This equipment is used in routine drug enforcement. It's used in home invasions like the one that killed Breonna Taylor. Police will drive up in an armored vehicle. They'll use a battering ram. They'll use flash grenades. They'll use military grade rifles and so forth. You've got a situation where violence is already part of the mix, but this just elevates it to a whole different level. And these have gone to communities as small as Moundsville, West Virginia, which got an MRAP. It's a population 8,400 people. There's been an upsurge in the program since Trump came in. There were some limited regulations imposed by President Obama after the pictures came back from Ferguson of them using military vehicles against the demonstrators there. And it was, a few types of equipment could not be transferred. There had to be more scrutiny as to why the department needed them. You couldn't give away a tank. You couldn't give away grenade launchers. But there was still quite a bit of equipment flowing. But the limits that were put on were lifted under Trump. And we've had near record levels of transfers in terms of amounts of equipment during the Trump years. And as I was saying before we came on, this is a bonus to defense contractors, because basically they take this equipment, they declare it surplus, and then they replace it with new equipment. So as it flows to the police, it creates a place in the Pentagon budget to buy new armored vehicles. And they're going to buy from Oshkosh Truck 50,000 at least joint light tactical vehicles, which is their replacement for the MRAP. So there's money to be made here by the military industrial complex. The program has also been exposed for having incredibly lax oversight. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, created a non-existent fake law enforcement agency, and we're able to get approval for $1.2 million of military equipment within a week's time. So they're just basically been shoving this stuff out the door with very few questions asked. In context, I think a lot of this is being battled out at the local level in the sense of calls to defund the police and put money into local services to the communities that have been victims of police violence rather than being served by the police. And if you step back and look at the national and global scale, there's parallel developments in the wars at home and abroad and how they interlink. The United States has trained repressive police and military forces in places like the Philippines, Egypt, Burkina Faso, who have gunned down demonstrators in the streets. So our government is no stranger to arming repressive police forces. They do it abroad, they do it at home. In terms of the funding, police departments nationally get a total of about $100 billion a year, all the different localities added up. Some places it's up to 40% of the local budget. Then if you look at the national budget, you've got $740 billion for the Pentagon, which is more than half of the federal discretionary budget. Leaves very little room for all the other things we need to make people safe. And then of course you've got mass incarceration, and it's at least $120 billion a year on prison systems, and that's probably a conservative estimate. So altogether, you've got $1 trillion funding some sort of militarization, repression at the federal, state, and local levels. And that $1 trillion could go far in housing, education, in restorative justice programs, in dealing with the pandemic, all these things that are actual threats to people's lives, as opposed to the things that the administration would like us to focus on, sort of the bogus threats. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say, just to kick things off. But I look forward to hearing from the panelists and having a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Let's go now to Dan McFadden for the view from Massachusetts.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dan McFadden. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight and be part of this panel. I am a staff attorney at the ACLU of Massachusetts. I'm a litigator, so we file and pursue lawsuits on behalf of victims of police misconduct to protect their civil rights and civil liberties. Additionally, I bring some perspective as a former officer in the military. I served in the Navy from 2001 until 2006. And part of my job in the Navy was actually to develop policies and procedures for the use of force and to train sailors on how to implement those policies and procedures. So I have some perspective on what the military actually does. And to a certain extent, I think that informs what I see happening with police departments, because I think folks who actually have seen how the military operates are concerned in many cases because the police seem in some cases to be much more aggressive than what would be permitted in the military. They have equipment that is military grade equipment, but using it in ways that actually go beyond what would be permitted in the military, outside of the military accountability channels that exist. An example of that, I think, is the clearing of Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. recently, where we saw the National Guard commander actually blow the whistle on federal civil police forces who had used force unnecessarily against protesters. So I just say that I'm happy to address questions to that, but I think that in some cases, militarization of equipment leads to conduct by police that in fact exceeds what the actual military would do in terms of aggression. At the ACLU of Massachusetts, we are pursuing police accountability and police reform in a variety of ways. There's a pending police reform bill in the Massachusetts legislature, which we've been supportive of. And I would encourage everyone to call their representative or state senator and encourage that bill to move forward. It includes many important provisions, some of which I will discuss later, but among them certain reforms to qualified immunity, which is a doctrine that limits police accountability. We also litigate cases on behalf of victims of police misconduct. We recently represented a mentally ill woman who had walked away from a hospital and was tackled and tased by a police officer. We represent a family that was the victim of a no-knock SWAT team raid on the wrong apartment. We represent the estate of a woman who was arrested, said that she couldn't breathe, asked for medical attention, did not receive it, and later died. So, through litigation, we have been protecting the rights of individuals. We also do public records litigation to increase transparency. We recently sued the Boston Police Department based on a pattern of failure to timely respond to requests for public information. But another thing that we've been doing is monitoring the implementation of the 1033 program in Massachusetts. That began in 2012 with a records request that ACLU of Massachusetts made to the Mass State Police. And those records are available on our Data for Justice Project website. You can go to data.aclum.org and you can find those records there. And that resulted in a report in 2014, which is also available on our website, called Our Houses Are Not Battlefields. And there were a number of key findings in that report, but among them were that there was a large amount of military weaponry and vehicles that were coming into Massachusetts through this program, including things like even grenade launchers. And in 2012, for example, Massachusetts agencies had requested more than $2 million in equipment from the Department of Defense. And there appeared to be no prior public disclosure of these requests by Massachusetts agencies and municipalities. So there wasn't an opportunity for the public to weigh in before this equipment was received. And that was very troubling. And in addition to that, it was coupled with some other factors I think that made it more troubling. One is that the acquisition of this technology and equipment was in many cases coupled with the adoption of military style tactics. And in one instance, for example, one municipality adopted counterinsurgency tactics that were expressly imported from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so that was very disturbing as well. And there were also limited accountability and transparency mechanisms in place for the users of this equipment. We found in that report that SWAT teams, which in Massachusetts are often organized in collective organizations for multiple towns or communities, that these SWAT team organizations were not particularly responsive to public records requests. And also there weren't common standards for conduct, common standards for record keeping, which made it difficult in many cases for the public to understand how this equipment was being utilized by the police. We have subsequently been following the 1033 program for a significant period of time after 2014. And one way to do that is by looking at the Defense Logistics Agency. Their website, dla.mil, has a roster of the equipment that's been transferred and is currently being tracked within the states. According to the DoD, currently more than $8.1 million of military equipment is being tracked in the possession of Massachusetts state and local law enforcement. Just as an example of that, since 2014, according to DoD, 5 MRAPs have been transferred into Massachusetts. These are these large vehicles that Bill was talking about. They're large armored vehicles that were designed to drive over an explosion from a mine or from an improvised explosive device and to deflect that blast out away from the crew and the passengers to protect them. Now, to the best of my knowledge, Massachusetts has not had an epidemic of landmine attacks on police officers. And yet we seem to be bringing in significant numbers of these vehicles into our state and into places that perhaps are somewhat counterintuitive. Just to give you an example, according to the DoD, an MRAP arrived here in Massachusetts in June of this year, just a couple months ago. It went to Marshfield, Massachusetts, population 25,000. In 2019, Marshfield was ranked the 6th safest community in the United States. So it raises some questions. Why are they procuring an MRAP from the Department of Defense? They apparently provided some rationale for the Department of Defense, and they said active shooter, hostage rescue, downed officer rescue, barricaded suspect, high risk search warrants. A lot of those scenarios don't seem to be particularly probable in the 6th safest community in the United States. But a concern is the idea that they're going to use this to serve search warrants on people. That suggests that this large military vehicle is going to be active in the streets of Marshfield, Massachusetts. And certainly it's not the only community. Another community that, according to the Department of Defense, received one of these vehicles is Oak Bluff on Martha's Vineyard, population 5,000 people, roughly. So that raises some questions as to why these vehicles are being procured and really what they're going to be used for. And certainly a lot of concerns that we have militarization that's pretty obviously not justified in Massachusetts. In the wake of all of this, and particularly in the wake of the deployment of federal civilian police forces within the United States from CBP, that's the Customs and Border Protection, from the Bureau of Prisons. Bureau of Prisons came to Washington, D.C. during the recent protests there. The deployment of these forces recently, decked out in military equipment without adequate identifying information to figure out which officers may be breaking the law, using very aggressive tactics, including attacking people who present no obvious immediate threat. And even things like in Portland, grabbing people off the streets into unmarked vans. In the wake of this, plus the mirror image of that in many cases happening at the state level around the country, the ACLU has called for the abolition of the 1033 program. We understand some of our partners are not necessarily there yet, but I think given recent events, at this time it seems like halting militarization, where it stands at least today by abolishing 1033, is an important policy objective. And that would be at the federal level, but at the state level, there are also reforms that have been proposed. Part of the bill that's pending right now from the Senate in the Massachusetts legislature for police reform includes a limitation on the use of the 1033 program. We as a state, have the power to regulate how our state actors engage with this program. And this particular provision would require that before a municipality acquires equipment through this program, that there be public notice in advance, a public hearing, and an opportunity for the community to engage and express their opinion as to whether or not this is, justified and appropriate acquisition by the police department. And, I think that that's another reason to support those pending bills. The idea that there would be some community involvement in advance so that people can have a say in how they're policed. The police officers in our country are civilian officials. They're supposed to be, acting neighbor to neighbor to help people. And yet, so often, I think that there's a concern that they, behave like an occupying force. And so hopefully, encouraging that upfront community involvement would be a meaningful check to ensure that we have police that are functioning in a way that we think serves the public interest.
Thank you, Dan. And now let's go to Yasmine to get the perspective from DC and Congress.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cole. Thank you to Mass Action, my co-panelists, and thank you so much to all of you for joining us on a Monday night to talk about how we can all work together to rein in specifically the 1033 program and work together to end police militarization. So my co-panelists did a really great job of, giving an overview of what this program is, and specifically also what's happening at the state level. What I wanted to discuss was, talking about kind of concrete steps and actions that everybody on this Zoom call can take back to your communities, to your fellow activists, neighbors, right, families and friends, and ways that we can really work together to continue to put pressure on our congressional leaders to understand how incredibly vital it is for us to essentially and finally, work towards, as Dan has mentioned, shutting down and abolishing this program once and for all. I mean, the fact that nothing has happened in terms of reining in this program since Michael Brown was gunned down in Ferguson. In fact, after the national protests, after he was murdered in Ferguson, this program in fact expanded. A couple of years later, provisions were added to expand militarization at the border. So as Bill mentioned, this program impacts our border communities. It impacts, law enforcement, local, state, federal agencies that want to engage in either, counterterror activities or activities related to drugs as well. And what we've been trying to do, at least at my organization, Demand Progress, it's a fairly new organization. It's, we were founded about 10 years ago, and my job is specifically to work on ending militarization at home and abroad. So, since I joined the organization, specifically after George Floyd was murdered, as Cole mentioned, we put together this bipartisan 1033 coalition that right now includes over 100 organizations. It includes progressive, moderate, conservative groups, conservative organizations such as R Street, Freedom Works, American Conservative Union. I mentioned that so, folks on this call can understand that this is an issue that is really supported. It's a bipartisan issue. Organizations on the far right and far left and in between have been working to rein in this program, and it's really unfortunate that we haven't been able to be successful. And it's really, I believe that we need to continue to push our congressional leaders. We need to continue to emphasize to them why this fight is not a short-term fight. This is something that we've been working on for many, many years to ensure that specifically communities of color are not terrorized, that they don't have, again, armored vehicles rolling down their streets. This is just common sense reforms that we've been asking for. And my co-panelists mentioned, I think, a little bit about, how this program came about and how it's even authorized and what sort of mechanisms are in place and efforts that could be taken, again, to rein in this program. So the provision that authorizes this program is through the National Defense Authorization Act. This is a must-pass bill that comes through Congress every single year. So after the protests in Ferguson, several of our organizations at that time, I was with the Quakers, and our organization was one of many organizations that worked on lobbying members of Congress to, if not completely shut down the program, to at least severely limit and rein in the program. So we worked for many, many months to support the bill that Congressman Hank Johnson introduced. Congressman Johnson has been working on this issue for many years in terms of working, again, to end police militarization. And post the murder of George Floyd, Congressman Johnson reintroduced his bill, and the language for his legislation was actually incorporated in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that, as many of you on this call know, passed the House with bipartisan support. So we were really grateful that that's currently in the policing bill that passed the House. Right now, they're negotiating in the Senate. And unfortunately, we're just not sure how that's going to move forward. So what we've been trying to do since George Floyd's murder is to try to ensure that we get the strong 1033 provisions in basically every must-pass bill that you can think of. So we were successful, thank goodness, in at least getting Hank Johnson's provision in the Defense Appropriations Bill, which passed the House. Right now, we actually are not it's not clear what the appropriations schedule will be like after the November elections, but it's in the defense approach, which is a great sign. But the reason why we started this coalition and we really focused on trying to get this provision passed and incorporated in the NDAA is as I noted, NDAA is one of very few bills that both chambers absolutely have to act on and have to pass. So the House and Senate has already passed their versions of the NDAA. What's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, so after the November elections, is they're negotiating right now what we call, conferencing. But after the November elections is when the final conference bill, final negotiated bill for NDAA will pass. And to just, I guess, talk a little bit about the NDAA fight that happened on 1033, if it's helpful to kind of talk a little about the politics and what we were able to accomplish in the House and Senate and what we're trying to do during conference negotiations right now. So in the Senate, as many of you know, we were very supportive of Senator Schatz's 1033 amendment. While his amendment was not going to completely shut down the program, it would specifically have, prohibited the use of transferred equipment against First Amendment protected activities. So, and the list of prohibitions on the transferred equipment was pretty extensive and comprehensive that we were happy about. It even included tear gas, which Hank Johnson's legislation did not, but I'm happy to kind of go through that if folks have questions in the Q&A period about what was specifically included in his legislation in terms of prohibited items for transferring to local law enforcement. So while we were able to receive a bipartisan, vote on that amendment, the amendment actually received 51. It was 51 to 49. So we had 4 Republicans, Murkowski, Paul, Gardner, and Daines, that also voted for that amendment to the NDAA. The amendment, however, still failed because of the 60 vote threshold that we unfortunately needed. And the other, alternative, that the 1033 amendment that passed the Senate, which, we weren't happy about, it was a very, very watered down amendment that was offered by Senator Inhofe. He's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. So he essentially just wanted to offer his amendment, something for his caucus to vote on. So his amendment passed 90 to 10. And I mean, it's I guess fine that passed. It's certainly not what we wanted, but as advocates, we were also cognizant that we weren't publicly opposing the Inhofe amendment because we wanted at least something passed in the NDAA. That way it would put us in a better negotiating position during conference. So moving to the House, the reason why I wanted to do the House last is because it was unfortunately very disappointing and depressing and very complicated what happened in the House. We were given multiple assurances by, leadership, our friends in the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and also, the leads and friends that we were communicating within Representative Adam Smith's office, who's the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. And we were under the impression that Hank Johnson's 1033 amendment was going to be made in order, which meant we thought we were going to get a vote on the floor. And if we had gotten a vote on the floor, we knew that it was going to pass because it had already passed in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We were focusing all of our efforts on the Schatz fight and trying to ensure that we got his amendment passed because we were all under the impression that we were set in the House. So unfortunately, the amendment did not get a vote, and it was, there's a lot of politics involved, but essentially what happened was there were a number of police unions. The last hour, 18 hours before the Rules Committee hearing, they reached out to a number of Democrats on the House Armed Services Committee and pressured them to essentially tell them not to support the inclusion of that amendment. So the amendment was never made in order. Representative Hank Johnson's office literally got a call from the whip's office, again, 12 hours before the rules hearing, telling them that their amendment was not going to get a vote. And it was incredibly disappointing is one way to put it. But, for us, seeing folks that are supposed to be our friends, that are supposed to be on our side, cave like that was really, to me, unacceptable. And it was an issue that, as again, COAL is part of this coalition. There's millions and millions of Americans, as you see all across the country, that have been calling on our congressional leaders to rein in this program. Our organization alone has done a petition to calling for this program to be shut down. More than 60,000 of our members across the country have written to Congress calling for the program to be abolished. So, I think that moving forward, we need to continue to let our congressional leaders know that what's happening is simply unacceptable. And the bare minimum is that this program needs to absolutely be reined in. And what's happening right now during conference negotiations is there is a letter that's being currently circulated by Representative Brown's office that I'll circulate to the 1033 listserv tomorrow on COAL if there's a way you can maybe send it around to folks on this call. And what we're going to be doing is encouraging as many House members to sign on to that letter. The letter is going to be sent to the chair and ranking members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, and also what we call conferees. So there's going to be a set of members that are going to be chosen to be part of this, whatever negotiations of the NDAA during conference negotiations. And the letter specifically asks for very strong 1033 language to be incorporated in the National Defense Authorization bill. And we are also working on another letter that's going to be a stronger letter, specifically from Representative Hank Johnson's office, and hopefully they'll agree to do that. And that letter is specifically going to be sent to, again, the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, calling for them to incorporate Hank Johnson's language in the NDAA. And Hank Johnson's language is the language that's the strongest that has passed both chambers. Again, during the Q&A period, I'm happy to kind of go through what it would do, but anything and everything you're seeing, in our communities across the country during protests with armored vehicles, almost all of that would be prohibited under Hank Johnson's legislation. So, I just wanted to encourage everyone to, continue doing what you're doing, continue to contact your members of Congress, letting them know how incredibly important it is to rein in and eventually shut down and abolish the 1033 program. And, there's opportunities for us moving forward in the NDAA. There's going to be obviously opportunities for us in engaging the next administration. We've gotten strong commitments from folks on the Biden team and saying that this is a priority for them. And then the final thing that we are going to be doing is there is also a coalition sign-on letter that we will likely do for the conference negotiations for NDAA, that organizations, like Peace Action, and if there's other organizational reps on this call, you're more than welcome to sign on to it, and we encourage you to do that. Final kind of call to action that we're going to allow, or another opportunity for the grassroots to engage, is we are looking to do a multi-partner, what we call list swaps, or these are essentially, it's essentially a petition that multiple organizations will co-sponsor. And we do this pretty regularly at Demand Progress, and our petitions generally have at least 100,000 folks that take action, and it's because it's a joint petition with several other organizations. And the idea for that is, as we're heading into, again, during the conference negotiations for NDAA and before the final vote, getting as many of those letters sent to your members of Congress, letting them know that this is a priority for them to incorporate strong 1033 language in the NDAA. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Yasmine. That was a deep dive. Appreciate that. So I'm going to take the privilege of the first question and ask any one of you three, what are the arguments in favor of the 1033 program that those people who think the police do need military equipment, how would they explain why they think it's so important? What are we up against here?
Bill, do you want to take that?
Yeah, if you all back me up. You know, they've got a number of things that they'll say. One is, you know, an active shooter, a bomb threat, you know, they sort of have specific scenarios where they say, oh, we must have this equipment. Of course, that's what they're actually using it for. Sometimes there's tiny things like, well, we get computers from them, or there's other equipment that's not armored vehicles that transfers through the program. But I think, you know, mostly it's this notion of that there's a much larger threat than in fact exists from, you know, domestic terror, or, I mean, the most important domestic terror groups are the ones that this administration is not doing anything about, which is the right-wing militias and supremacist groups. But anyway, so I think, yeah, they would sort of highlight these high-profile possible events as a reason for this huge flow of equipment. I'm sure there's other reasons, but I think that's one of the ones that they seem to return to.
Thanks, Bill. Dan or Yasmine, do you want a piece of that?
Yeah, just to echo what Bill said. So the letters, the opposition letters that these police unions were sending House members and senators, I mean, one, they were just riddled with inaccuracies and lies, but the arguments they continue to make is that in addition to the active shooter scenarios, that they need, you know, local police need this equipment in you know, in terms of response to various disaster relief situations. And again, the reason why I want to mention that is that every single piece of legislation that we've been supporting that, you know, that has been introduced on reforming this program has those waivers in it. And these unions, these police unions know that, and they're just disseminating false information to you know, House and Senate offices. But yeah, I mean, essentially they just say that this program is invaluable and we need it in terms of you know, protecting our own citizens and law enforcement.
Dan, do you want a piece, or up to you?
No, I mean, I think that probably sums it up. You know, and there are certain pieces of equipment in the program that, as I think Bill said, you know, are not armored vehicles. You know, but I think that you know, it's a concern. The easy availability of this equipment, you know, creates you know, a possibility of getting things, and once they're in the hands of police, I think what history tends to show us is that they will be used. Excuses will be found to use them, and you know, that's one of the principal concerns of I think the opposition to the program, is that you know, even if there are some arguable cost savings, the cost on the back end is that, you know, we now have this equipment very likely to be deployed in our communities in a way that is likely to compromise civil rights and civil liberties in many cases.
Great. Okay, so Brian, can you help some of the participants ask their questions?
Absolutely. And I just want to let people know that if you would like to ask your question live, just go ahead, and I see Michael has figured it out. You hit the participants button in the bottom of your screen, and then raise hand, and then I'll know that you would like to speak, and I will give you the chance. So let's go to Michael right now, and you can ask your question. Go ahead, Michael.
Am I unmuted now? Sorry about that.
We can hear you.
The question, what about other countries? I know this is the policy in the US, and we have issues that go back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s as far as concern about people in the streets protesting, the FBI, CONTOPR, all that kind of stuff. And then the whole defund the left concept that came up in the 80s, I think. And the whole idea is if we put the money into military, we can deny social programs. So what about overseas? Are there parallels overseas with militarization, or is this unique to America?
Maybe let's try Bill first for that one, although anyone could take it if you like.
Yeah, yes, there are parallels, and many of the cases are linked. You know, if U.S. supported a coup in Egypt, and the current regime is, well, initially, one of its early acts was to gun down over 1,000 demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators in the streets. Even criticizing the government can get you arrested. And they were also engaged in a quote unquote counterterror campaign, which has been primarily focused against political opponents. In the Philippines, under the guise of the drug wars, 27,000 people have been murdered by police, military, and police death squads without benefit of charges or trial, extrajudicial killings. There's been close cooperation and training between Israeli and American police and law enforcement forces. So the same techniques that are used in the occupation of Palestine have been swapped as techniques to be used on the streets of the United States. So I think there's a lot of examples of that sort of thing. Whether any of them have, you know, specific programs like 1033, exactly how they carried out, I don't know. But in many of those cases, not only are those governments militarized, but the U.S. government has a role in that by supplying training, military aid, selling equipment, doing joint, you know, cooperative efforts and so forth.
Okay.
Thanks, Bill. This next question is from Mark Stansbury. I'm going to read it. It's, how can you look up the amount of money that your state or locality is receiving through the 1033 program? If any of you three know the answer to that.
Dan was talking about some of that. So maybe you want to try that one, Dan?
Sure. So the program is administered in significant part through the Defense Logistics Agency. And that has a website, which is dla.mil. And if you go there, there's actually a page where you can pull spreadsheets that show what equipment is currently known to, from DoD's perspective, known to be deployed and being monitored in different localities. It's by state. And then also they can show you the transfers that have occurred within the last quarter, both to state entities and also to federal civilian law enforcement as well. So, you know, if you went there, you would see that in the last 3 months or so, about $340,000 worth of DoD equipment has gone to federal civilian law enforcement. So those spreadsheets are actually extremely useful. I think they, you know, you can sort them, you can search them, you can do sums, so you can actually develop quite a bit of information from that resource. Another resource would be, I think, to go through state public records law and talk to the municipalities or state agencies that are actually receiving equipment and asking them what they're getting and what they're doing with it.
Great, thanks, Dan. Bill and Yasmine, want to add anything?
No, I thought that was pretty complete.
Thank you. Okay, who's next?
Great. Next, I am going to turn it over to Kate Frank. Kate, if you'd like to ask your question.
I've got a, yeah, I guess I'm unmuted.
Yes.
I'm, from the sound of the efforts that people have already made to, with the House of Representatives I mean, with the Senate, unless we change the composition of the Senate, you may get stopped there. I'm wondering if you have to go back to an earlier level and have much less of this kind of weaponry approved for any use. Because part of the problem is they have too much. I mean, from the manufacturer's point of view, they'd be delighted to sell it. But if they didn't have the funding to produce as much as they produce, would that help? Is that too naive a question?
No,
Would it
not at
just-
all.
Yasmine, you want to try that one, Yasmine? Or whoever?
Sure, and I think Bill would do a better job of answering this. So one of the key things that our organizations have been also doing is pushing for a spending cut to the Pentagon budget. So this past year, again, advocating for certain provisions to be incorporated into the NDAA. There was an amendment in the House that was offered by Representative Pocan and Senator Bernie Sanders in the Senate that would have supported a 10% spending cut for the DoD. I mean, those are efforts that we should do everything we possibly can to reduce the bloated defense budget. I think that would be helpful. And as you probably know, the equipment that is transferred from this program to local law enforcement agencies, they get it for free, right? It's surplus equipment. It's just lying around, and the local law enforcement agencies just apply for it. I don't know if Bill wants to add to that, but.
Yeah, I think we have to go at both sides of it. I mean, there's a lot of surplus equipment already sitting around, so we do need to block that. But going forward, if we had a Pentagon budget that was actually what was needed to defend the country, not what's being used to invade countries all over the world and engage in these forever wars, you wouldn't have a situation where you had 27,000 MEMRAPs sitting around that you could then give to police forces. So I see the two issues as joined. And I think if we don't demilitarize our federal government to a significant degree, it'll be harder to demilitarize our state and local police.
Yeah, and thanks Yasmine for raising that issue of the 10% cut. That's something that we at Mass Peace Action worked a lot on, and I'm pleased to say that all but one member of our congressional delegation voted in favor of that. So we still need to do a lot more work on that, but things are trending in the right direction. Kate's question actually lends itself to another that was asked by Herb Kimsey. Isn't the 1033 program, in fact, just a huge subsidy to these defense contractors? Bill
Yes.
talked a little bit about that, but do we know if there's involvement from the military companies in trying to fight against a 1033 repeal?
I haven't seen that. I mean, Yasmine's closer to it because she's on the front lines on the Hill, but it benefits some defense companies, but it's in the context of a $740 billion Pentagon budget. So they're tending to be lobbying for things like, I want to build a new nuclear bomber that's going to cost, $1 billion or $500 million each, or I want to build the next generation F-35 fighter plane, or I want to build a nuclear submarine. So they tend to put their main lobbying going after big new money. They certainly do benefit from this. It's kind of like it's like the runoff from the militarized state. But I think probably in terms of who's got a stake in this, it's much more police forces, police unions doing the brunt of the lobbying, I believe.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I actually haven't seen any lobbying efforts by defense contractors with this program. I mean, if they're doing it very quietly because none of us heard about it, and I didn't see any letters from them.
Thank you both. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Emily, who has a question. Go ahead, Emily. Now you're unmuted.
Hey, thank you. Emily here from University of American University, among other places. But my question is, do we have any visibility into, or some kind of knowledge to the extent to which these surplus munitions, but also body armor and armaments are getting onto the streets? And specifically, I'm thinking, commercially on the private market, black market, but also in the context of the white supremacist militaries, the militias that are all over our country now. I was in Charlottesville for the 2017 invasion.
I think you may be breaking up, unless that's my connection.
Invasion of Charlottesville, and I couldn't help but notice how much
Emily, you're breaking up pretty bad, but I think we got the essence of your question, whether the military equipment is getting out on the streets beyond the uniformed forces into private hands, or such as white supremacist groups. Would anyone like to opine on that?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that. I mean, a lot of this, you can't buy a MRAP on the market, but if you're buying body armor and some of this other equipment, it's all too readily available without having to have it illicitly transferred from your local police department. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's not happening. It's not something I've looked into, really.
Okay, the next question is Siddhartha. Would you like to go ahead? You are unmuted now. Siddhartha? Can always go back to you. Let's go to James Cerrone. You're up, James.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Hear you fine,
Yes.
James.
Yes.
All right. So there's been some consternation about the term military grade. And I think I know what we all mean by military grade, but I'd just like to get some clarification, especially because, if we're going to be putting forth bills to limit or abolish the 1033 program, that term is going to need to be used, and it's going to need to be clarified about what exactly do we mean by preventing quote unquote military grade equipment by being used by the police around the country.
Does anyone want to define military grade particularly?
Well, I don't have a technical definition of it. Generally, we've been talking about equipment that's used in combat zones being transferred from the Pentagon to police departments. So I think, the definition will be important if that's the way you hook a particular bill. If you were saying no military grade equipment to police departments, obviously it'd be very important how that was defined. If you shut down the 1033 program altogether, then that's less of an issue for that part of what we're doing, because then you're not allowing the Pentagon to transfer any kind of equipment to local police forces. But I don't know if, Dan, through your ACLU connections, or Yasmine, through debates over legislation on the Hill, whether this has come up.
So it hasn't come up, but if you're interested in getting the definition from Hank Johnson's legislation, I'm happy to read it for you. It says, let's see. So federal, state, and local law enforcement departments across the country are eligible again to acquire free military grade weapons and equipment that could be used inappropriately during policing efforts in which people and taxpayers could be harmed. This is the clause leading into them discussing what is considered a controlled and uncontrolled equipment, military grade equipment. So the list that they have says, for instance, for controlled equipment, it's weapons, explosives such as flashbang grenades, mine-resistant ambush protected vehicles, long-range acoustic devices, aircraft capable of being modified to carry armament that are combat coded, and silencers, among other military grade items. And then they also had like a description of like what was uncontrolled and controlled.
Thank you.
Looks like Siddhartha is unmuted now. So,
Okay,
Hi.
go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Hear you fine. Go ahead with your question.
Thank you. I was wondering how 1033 would impact operation like Waco against the bunch of civilians that occurred so many years ago. That was pretty formidable in terms of manpower and the equipment that they used. And it's hard to think of anything more lethal than what was done in Waco. But I was wondering, therefore, if that sort of thing were to happen today, what exactly would be the difference in the equipment used? Is that question answerable? I'm not sure that it is, but that's the question that occurred to me.
Any of the three of you like to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. There's kind of a twofold problem. One is federal agencies themselves being hyper armed, like ICE and the Border Patrol, so forth. And then there's the transfer of similar kinds of equipment to local law enforcement. But, what would happen and what kind of equipment would be deployed in a Waco style situation now, I don't know. And of course, we have a president who seems to be itching to deploy the military directly in some of these situations. So, I'm sure there'd be large quantities of very dangerous equipment deployed were there such a situation. But I don't know how it might compare to what's been done in the past.
Dan or Yasmine, do you have anything to add to that one particularly? Okay, we'll go on to the next question then. Let's see, I forget exactly who it was, but someone was asking Dan if you could restate the exact bills in the state legislature that you were referring to. I know you answered it in the chat, but I think everyone would benefit from hearing you do so on video. So if you could tell us the name of the bills and who we should be putting pressure on, I think that would be very helpful. Go ahead, Dan.
Sure. Sorry, I was just pulling up the numbers. So the bills are House 4886 and Senate 2820. So I am not myself a legislative affairs person, but my understanding, having spoken with them, is that these bills have both passed the respective houses and are now in a conference process where the houses are attempting to reconcile differences between the bills. Just as an example, there are some significant differences between the degree of reform to qualified immunity that is contained in the different bills. And so, I think that in terms of who to put pressure on, I would encourage everyone who's watching, who is in Massachusetts, to contact your state representative or your state senator or both, and ask that these bills be advanced and that they contain meaningful reform. Particularly things like qualified immunity, which has been one of the issues spotlighted, I think, in the media in Massachusetts. For those who don't know, and I don't mean to get too far off track here, but for those who don't know, qualified immunity is a doctrine that prevents suits against police officers who violate the Constitution if they do so in a way that is sufficiently novel And therefore, it's a real barrier to application of the rule of law and, legal accountability for police officers and justice for victims. So I hope folks, will feel free and to contact their elected representatives here in Massachusetts and encourage these bills to move forward and encourage them to contain meaningful and powerful reform to qualified immunity so that people who are victimized by police misconduct, will have meaningful redress.
Thanks, Dan. I have a question myself for Yasmine. We were also very surprised in that NDAA process when the Hank Johnson's amendment did not get a vote in the House formulation of the NDAA. You talked a little bit about police unions having an effect on both House Armed Services and perhaps on the Rules Committee. Do you know particularly who made that call? Was it in Rules? Was it Adam Smith and House Armed Services?
Yeah, so the call was made by Adam Smith and also the Whip's office. This is Representative Clyburn. And what we heard, so we saw that the Senate letters that were going around, this was, it was specifically Fraternal Order of Police and also National Association of Police Organizations. And we heard the same unions were reaching out last minute to House Dems on the Armed Services Committee. We were sort of told who some of those Dems were that then objected to getting a vote on the amendments, but it's not something we can unfortunately make public. A number of organizations were upset and wanted to, do some accountability measures and reach out to those Dems that were responsible essentially for derailing our efforts in the House. For us, the reason why it was so incredibly just disheartening and disappointing what happened was, again, Cole probably knows this. We were working for months and months. As in right after the murder of George Floyd, the second that happened, we were working tirelessly to develop our strategies in the House and Senate. And the fact that we went in thinking all of our efforts were supposed to be focused on the Senate is because that's what we were told. And since we saw that the Hank Johnson amendment already passed in the George Floyd Justice and Policing bill, we again were under the impression we were all set. And literally the night, very late night, the night before the rules hearing was supposed to happen the following morning, we were told it wasn't going to happen because, and specifically, it was because the Whip's office was under the impression that NDAA in the House was just not going to pass if they added the Hank Johnson amendment. So for instance, if Johnson's amendment was given a vote, yes, it would have passed on the floor. We knew that. And they were under the impression that, because some of these moderate or conservative Dems were no longer going to be voting for the NDAA as a result, and they didn't want to be put in that position because they want to be, they want to look tough, right, on national security. It's an election year. Yes. They do not want to vote no. So they really put pressure on Adam Smith and leadership in telling him not to bring the amendment up for a vote. And for us, we were also promised by Adam Smith's office that they were not going to take up 1033 in committee because we lobbied House Armed Services Committee members very aggressively. So we sent a coalition letter during markup. 100 organizations signed on to that letter, calling on committee members to support provisions during the markup of the NDAA to abolish this program. And we were told by Adam Smith's office that, listen, we can't, take this up during committee, but don't worry, we're going to take it up on the floor. So it's just every step of the way, they've kind of, I'm sorry, but screwed us. And it's incredibly disheartening because, as I noted, these are supposed to be members, these are Democrats, these are members that you see publicly making statements about the importance of passing, policing reform legislation, and that they're on the side of protesters, and, well, they weren't on this, so.
Thanks for the clarification. Appreciate it. Our next question is going to come from Nancy Gallant. Go ahead.
Okay, hi. A week ago, I got a mailing, a fundraising from the United States Deputy Sheriff's Association in Merrifield, Virginia, which claims that they need money to arm our local police department. I'm in Rockland, Maine. Rockland Police, and this big thing, Rockland, Maine Area Drive for America's Police and Sheriff's Emergency Equipment Shortage. And it goes on about, it says the money is needed because it claims that there are ambush shootings of our police officers that have increased at staggering rates with the anti-cop movement and riots, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know where these people got my address, and I'm wondering where the money actually would be going. And anybody know about these people?
I don't know if any of you would like to take that up, but I will say for myself that I have gotten similar calls. I think it's not all that unusual.
This is a letter. They have my address. That freaked me out a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know that particular organization. Maybe put their name in the chat. We can dig into it.
I did.
Oh, okay. I'll check it out.
Thanks,
Okay,
Bill.
we have time for one more question if there is more.
Sure. I think this has been answered over the course of the program tonight, but I think it bears some repetition. Claire Gosler asks, what is the best way and a clear way that we can oppose the 1033 program on a local, state, and federal level? So I think I would welcome all three of you to take a bite at that one.
Sure, I guess I can quickly go and talk about just very key things you can do at the federal level. So I put in the chat a link to the Demand Progress petition. This is the petition that calls on Congress to abolish the program altogether. We've had tens and tens of thousands of our members sign on to it, and we're continuing to send those letters because of the upcoming vote on the NDAA. So I encourage you, either support petitions that other organizations are doing, or if your organization has the capacity, then kindly try to do a petition on your own. And then, in addition to that, for those on the call that have close relationships with your members, either in the House or in the Senate, shoot them an email, shoot their staff a note. Everybody is remote. That all they're doing all day is reading emails. So tell them that, you participated in this webinar, and you really want to make sure that their boss supports efforts to rein in the 1033 program, right? By supporting provisions to try to demilitarize our communities. And, it's very easy for them to do that by supporting strong 1033 language in the defense bill that's going to be voted on either late November or December.
Bill or Dan, would you like to pick it up? What would you like to see from the activists on this call?
Yeah, I think there's a few things at the state and local level that you should definitely consider. So, one, I've talked about the fact that there's some legislation potentially pending at the state level, and I think that that's very important. Two, I think there's information gathering that anyone can do in Massachusetts. We have a pretty strong public records law in Massachusetts, and you can go to your city or town website if you're interested in understanding what equipment they are acquiring and how they're using it. And most of them have a web submission form where you can put in a request and ask for records as long as you identify them with sufficient specificity so they know what you're looking for. So you can actually collect information on your own through our public records law. And I guess the last thing more generally is that I think that at the state level, we have to remember that we live in a country where sometimes we have what's sometimes referred to by the courts as kind of dual sovereignty, where we have a federal government and a state government. And the state government cannot disobey valid federal laws necessarily, but the federal government cannot co-opt the state government and make it do things. So what that means is that our state government, even if there's a federal program that exists and makes equipment available, our state government does not have to participate in that program. It has the choice. And that choice is largely going to be driven by democratically exerted pressure at the state level, not just elections, but also other forms of activism. So I think that each and every one of us can take steps to try to encourage our state to decline to participate in federal programs that we think are ultimately harmful to the way that our state government operates. And that doesn't just go for the 1033 program. That also goes for things like in the field of immigration, the Safe Communities Act, declining to provide information that supports the operations of Trump's deportation machine. That's something as well where the state is not obligated to help. And so I just think that's an important principle to remember. We as a state have our own agency. We can decide to decline to participate in these types of federal programs, to decline to help the federal government. And in some cases, that's a very justified and important position for us to take.
Bill, any thoughts?
Well, I do this, I have the privilege of working on these issues for a living at a nonprofit. And there's so many outrages per day, I can't keep up myself sometimes. And so I think as an activist, it's very helpful to work through an organization. So whether it's Mass Peace Action, Friends Committee on National Legislation, Women Without War, there's organizations that are both keeping track of all these issues and when is a good time to weigh in, but also drawing the connections. Peace Action works on nuclear weapons, they work on the military budget, they work on the militarization of the police, and they do this kind of outreach to people around the country. So I would say, in addition to what you want to do as a good citizen, joining an organization is, I think, one of the most efficient ways to try to have an effect.
I think that's great advice, and thanks for giving it, Bill. Really appreciate it. And I just want to let everyone know that all these links that have been shared in the chat and have been referred to by our panelists, I have been taking them down, and they will be shared with everyone who's on this call in a follow-up email that also includes a recording of this program. And we would encourage you to please share it widely with family and friends who couldn't attend. We need to get as many eyeballs on this as possible. So I want to say thank you to everyone. And now I'll turn it over to Cole for some closing remarks.
Yeah, and thank you to our panelists. We did a great job tonight. I think we've got a better understanding of how these programs work and the impact they're having in our communities. Mass Peace Action as a peace organization sees the 1033 program and the militarization of police as one of the ways that we can, as an organization, connect with the overall police reform or defund the police movement that's gripping the country right now, because it ties in with our work on the military budget and on militarization abroad. So we will be following up and calling on you, as well as all of our other supporters, to contact the state legislature about the policing bill, and also to follow up on Yasmine's suggestions as she sends them to us during the fall, so that we can intervene in the Congress and try to get a favorable result on 1033 this year. Just to mention a few upcoming events as well. On Wednesday, there's another webinar called The Wars Are Here, How Our Post 9/11 Wars Help Militarize Our Police, by the Cost of War Project at Brown University. And Yasmine is also going to speak on that webinar along with Representative Hank Johnson. And it's Wednesday at 6 p.m. And we will carry it live on our Facebook page. And then the same night, we have a webinar on global cooperation or new Cold War, the People's Foreign Policy, with Max Elbaum and Peter Chow at 7 p.m. Wednesday night. The next webinar in our Anti-Racism and Peace series is called Trump Brings America's Dirty Wars Home by Stuart Schrader. And he's a scholar that studies how the US exported counterinsurgency and sort of aggressive policing strategies to third world countries through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and how that ultimately lays the basis for what's happening back to us now. September 28th at 7 p.m. And that's the next one in our Anti-Racism and Peace series. So with that, I will bid everyone good night. Thank you for joining. It was an interesting and important discussion, and let's stick together and follow up on these problems. Thank you all.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thanks, everybody.
everyone.
Bye-bye.